Okay, hello everybody. Real quick, a little bit about me. My name is We Go Giant. Is there anybody here who has never been to a Games Done Quick before? Show of hands. All right, few people, hello. Well, my first name is Sean, but just so you know, it is actually very, very common at Games Done Quick and similar events for people to go by their online monikers instead. I've got a lot of friends who I've met at this event and previous events who, for several of them, I don't even know what their real names are. So I go by Wego or Giant, whichever you prefer. If you're looking for a way to reach me, I have my email address there. And on Discord, I am Wego Giant number 3835 with capital WG, capital W, capital G, and capital G. And I know Discord is changing their naming things soon, so I'm hoping to get We Go Giant once that clicks through for me, but we'll see how that goes. So, yeah, quick story about this panel. About a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, there's a friend of mine named Grace who, in the pandemic, started getting into video games. She had never really played video games that much in her life, but decided, hey, a lot of people are picking up Animal Crossing and a bunch of other stuff. So she decided to give it a shot, and she decided to also start Twitch streaming. And I was like, hey, there's this whole subset of the video game hobby called speedrunning, and it's totally awesome. And if you're interested, I can go on your show and teach you all about what speedrunning is and why it's so cool. And maybe you'd get into it and, you know, check out an event like Games Done Quick at some time. And she said yes, then I was like, all right, cool. So I set this up, and when GDQ announced that they were bringing panels back, I was like, hey, this actually could work out really well. Because, you know, I figure at any given event, there's going to be some folks who this is their first time coming to a Games Done Quick. Maybe they don't really know that much about speedrunning. Maybe they don't really know that much about video games in general. But this is a really cool thing that the folks at Games Done Quick put together every year. So personally, I am just a guy. Like, I don't work for Games Done Quick. I'm not a member of the staff. I barely ever actually do speedruns myself. I've only ever gotten competitive in one game, and that was back in 2019. So where I was, I think 21st on the leaderboard back then. By now, I'm probably in the hundreds because so many other people have come on and beaten my old time. But I am a fan of Games Done Quick, and I'm a fan of speedrunning, and I think it's super cool. So I put this together to, you know, hopefully give you all some information about exactly why this is such an awesome event. So first and foremost, there is one rule of speedrunning, and that is you do not talk about, no, I'm kidding. I figure that joke's been overdone. Any game can be speedran. Speedran? I don't know, that feels weird to me. Any game can be done as a speedrun. It doesn't matter how new the game is, how old the game is, what system it's on, as long as you have three things. You need a starting point, you need a finish line, and you need rules that define how you go from A to Z. That's it. I like to think of it like, you know, the Olympics every 2 years comes around. A lot of the events are races, right? It's about doing a thing as quickly as possible. Running, bicycling, it's all over the place. But we collectively, as a society, decided 100 meters, that means something. 1,600 meters, that means something. 26.2 miles, that means something. But ultimately, we could have chosen any distances that we wanted. We can choose any type of race that we want. When it comes to speedrunning, everything else about this hobby is relativistic, and it kind of needs to be, because from game to game, everything is going to be so wildly different that you need to hold on to all of these ideas, these rules, these thought processes with a loose hand. Which means that you're going to have to ask yourself a lot of questions every time, like, what is a good starting point? What makes a good finish line? What's fun to perform? What's fun to watch? What makes for a fair competition? How can we verify that a runner has followed all of the rules? Unfortunately, cheating is a thing that happens from time to time in various communities, but you know, hopefully we won't have to really go into too much depth about that. If there's different versions of a game, should we split the leaderboard so that the two versions aren't competing against each other? Or are they similar enough that they should be combined into one? All of these kinds of questions, you need to hold the definitions loosely, because when you go from game to game, it's going to vary quite a lot. So even the most basic terms might have a slightly different definition depending on the game. So when it comes to breaking down speedrunning and learning about it, one of the biggest categories in terms of the taxonomy of speedrunning, if you're going to divide speedruns into any sort of categorization, this is the first place to do it, is live runs and TASes. And these are two overarching categories that sort of define a lot of what goes into speedrunning, right? Live runs are kind of just what they sound like. It's a human being with a controller or a mouse and keyboard. Usually these are competitive in nature. The runner is timing themselves and they are submitting their best time to an online leaderboard. If you're ever looking for those online leaderboards, the single most used website for that is www.speedrun.com. So if you're ever curious, hey, what's the world record for this? How many people run it? How long have runs of this game been done? What are the different categories? Speedrun.com, 99% of the time, will have all of that information for you, especially for English-speaking countries. But it's international. There are people who use speedrun.com from all over the world. Most communities require video proof, which is really interesting. In modern times, it's actually very easy to record yourself playing a video game. If you're playing on a console, you would use a device called a capture card to record your video, or on PC, oftentimes it can just be done natively through the PC very easily. But back in the day, before those kinds of things were so widespread, people would literally point a camcorder at their TV screens and send tapes in the mail. So to give you an idea of just how long this kind of thing has been going on. The rules usually require that you're playing an original game on original hardware. All right, so that means that you can't use emulators on your computer. Usually, it means as long as you're running a commercially available version of the game on commercially available hardware, that's typically the standard that they go by. And there's a few different timing standards that are out there. The most common is called real-time attack, or RTA timing. All that this means is, this is sort of a catch-all term that gets used very often to define the timing method. But basically, you start at the point where you're pressing new game or something like that at the start of the run, and you end at a point where you no longer need to be doing anything on the controller. Right? When you finish the last input, that's usually when the timer stops. What's interesting is that this allows for the player to go back and redo things. Right? It allows for them to keep going after they make a mistake, as long as the timer never stops, right? In some instances, if a game has an in-game timer, it can be a lot easier to use that instead. This usually ignores real time and only goes by what the video game itself says, which is really nice because if the game's in-game timer is inaccurate compared to real time, it guarantees that everybody is using the exact same standard and that everybody is being judged by the exact same measuring stick. There's also a bit of an antiquated timing method called Speed Demos Archive Timing, or SDA timing. Prior to Speedrun.com, there was another website called Speed Demos Archive that was sort of the precursor to Speedrun.com, where if somebody was going to be pointing a camcorder at a television and sending a tape in the mail, this actually might have been one of the websites that they would do that for. But that typically isn't used as often today. And then there are tool-assisted speedruns, or TASes. These are entirely different kinds of speedruns. And as the name implies, a TAS uses special tools to remove the human element and create a hypothetically perfect speedrun. These are not usually competitive in nature. They're not really being made for the sake of submitting to a leaderboard or trying to beat other people's times as much. The website, one of the websites out there that is sort of a really useful tool for learning more about tasks is taskvideos.org. What happens in tool-assisted speedrunning is essentially you're slowing down everything that's going on using emulators on a computer to pre-record all of the button inputs on the controller so that those can then get played back after the fact. And just in case there's anybody here who doesn't know what an emulator is a program that allows a computer to mimic or emulate other hardware, such as a video game console. Sometimes custom hardware can play back a pre-recorded set of inputs on real consoles. This is a process called console verification, and there's some friends of mine who run a community called TaskBot, where that's kind of what they do, is they create special hardware that's designed to play back tool-assisted speedruns as if it was being done on a literal controller on real hardware instead of it all being done through the computer. And sometimes this can have pretty hilarious results. I've set up some video clips here to kind of demonstrate some of the things that I'm going to be talking about, and this is the first one of those. They're all muted, but so that I can explain what's going on during it. But for this first one, we have a video from an earlier Games Done Quick event where you can see on the left, Dwango AC is the presenter of this particular clip. And you can see TaskBot, and you can see directly above Dwango's head there is a controller input, and you can see there's these little lights in the buttons. I want you to notice as Mario starts kicking off the walls, you see there's a little yellow light. We are back. Sorry about those technical difficulties, everybody. Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure at what point things got cut off there, but my understanding is it was during the video clip, is that right? Okay, so yeah, just to reintroduce this video here, and I'll actually play it one more time for y'all, and then we'll keep going on that. Yeah, so this is from a earlier Games Done Quick event featuring TaskBot, where this is a tool-assisted speedrun again. So there's no human being who's physically pressing these buttons in order to do this stuff. But on the left, you see Dwango AC, who is the person in charge of the presentation for this one. And above him, you see a controller, and there's a little yellow light that you're going to see every time Mario kicks off of the wall. You see a little yellow light there light up. Now, here's the thing. Mario is gaining speed every single time he kicks off the wall. And you need to press the A button to make Mario kick off the wall. But Mario only gains speed if you do it in the 1/30th of a second where he first comes in contact with the wall. If you do it too early, you won't kick off the wall and the whole thing fails. If you do it too late, you lose all the speed you've built and the whole thing fails. Which means, in theory, a human being could do this and press that A button perfectly every single time, but it's so difficult for a human being to do that in real time that instead, in this instance, you have a task showing off a hypothetically perfect speedrun where Mario's continually gaining more and more and more speed that eventually he can go right through the wall. It doesn't even check and uses that speed to get all the way through to the last level there. All right, so now that we are through that, it is time to talk terms. And before we even talk about terms that are specifically related to speedrunning, I think it's important that we get through some terms that are more about game design, because these are the kinds of things that will really help you out, especially if you're relatively new to video games in general. Now, I should say, I am not a game designer, which means that if you have somebody who knows about game design and has made video games before, they're going to look at some of these words and they're going to say, okay, yes, that's true. And they're going to look at other ones and they're going to be like, well, okay, that's a word we use, but we probably use it a little bit different. So this is in context of speedrunning. These are various game design terms that will come up all the time the more you watch things like Games Done Quick. The first one is input. Input is the signals from the controller or the mouse and keyboard that the system uses to change things in the game. At some point, every input in the system gets converted to code, right? At some point, a literal string of ones and zeros needs to go through in order for all of this stuff to work. Because at the end of the day, your video game console is basically just a computer. It might be designed slightly differently, but it has pretty much all of the same basic things that a computer does in it. Not all inputs can be read by the system all of the time. And that's kind of important as well, because if there's a situation where you want to be moving fast, but the system is working on something else right now and it can't read your inputs, there's not anything that you can do to speed that thing up, right? So figuring out all of these kinds of things in advance through practice and repetition is very important. The next one is frame. A frame similar to a frame in a movie or TV show. This is the length of time that it takes for the system to produce a single image. Most games run at about 30 or 60 frames per second. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. But that's a pretty standard that you're going to see throughout. Real quick, prior to the next one, PCs can sometimes unlock the frame rate of a game, which allows them to run at significantly higher frame rates than even 60 frames per second. The next term I have for you is lag, which is when a game is unable to display frames quickly enough, when there's just too much stuff going on the screen, and it doesn't know how to keep the clock and keep everything working at the same rate that it's supposed to, it will slow itself down to stop it from crashing. All right? Now that's an important thing, because if you're watching a movie or a TV show, it's not going to do that. It's just going to keep going at the same speed no matter what's happening. But for a video game, it needs to constantly produce the images while you're playing, which means in a lot of instances, avoiding lag whenever possible is usually faster and is sometimes very important in an older game, especially if it has a tendency to lag. Avoiding that lag can be very, very important for going fast. Next is map. Map, very simple. It's just the area of a game that is currently loaded. And within that map, that area that is loaded in, you will have actors. And actors are any character or object that the player can interact with. So basically, yeah, that's just the standard way that you can think about it in your head to get an idea of exactly what's going on in the game, what is there for the player to do. And oftentimes in 2D games, actors are called sprites. I don't fully know why they made that distinction, that they were called sprites in 2D games, and then when they moved to 3D, actors became a more common term. And again, these are terms that have some other words that people might use instead, but these are ones that I've heard fairly often for speedrunning purposes. The next term to talk about is triggers. Triggers are another thing that will be loaded into the map. Usually triggers are invisible. And a trigger tells the game to do something when the character comes into contact with the trigger. And there can be all different kinds of triggers that are loaded into a map that will, cause the game to do something as soon as the character comes into contact with it. But two of the most common are loading zone triggers. So this is a type of trigger that tells the game, all right, you've touched a loading zone, which means we need to unload the previous map and load in the next one. Or cutscene triggers. And a cutscene trigger says, all right, we need to paralyze the player's control of the character so that a story segment can play. The next one is collision. Collision is a physics term that relates to walls, floors, objects, characters, etc., coming in contact with each other. You might not think about this consciously while you're playing a video game, but every single object that's loaded into the map, every actor, needs to have collision. Otherwise, when two things come into contact with each other, they would just phase through each other. right? There needs to be something for the system to look at to say, okay, these are two solid objects, and these solid objects need to be able to come into contact with each other without phasing through one another. An important term that gets used often in relation to that is hitbox. A hitbox is the invisible physical boundary that the game uses to determine if two objects are colliding, right? So every object has the visible portion that you can see, and then they have the hitbox. And at the end of the day, Collision is only worried about the hitboxes. Collision doesn't care about the visual piece that you can see. It only cares about whether or not hitboxes are colliding with each other, which means oftentimes, especially in older games, an object's hitbox can look nothing like the object itself, right? And actually, I think I've got a video clip here. So this is a stream from a speedrunner named ZFG. He's playing a video game called Ocarina of Time, but he's not playing a standard version. He's playing what's called a practice ROM. So this is something that was created by members of the Ocarina of Time community to aid in practice for speedrunning Ocarina of Time. And it has a whole bunch of different things in it that allow you to set up basically whatever you want, whenever you want, in the game. And one of the things that it has is a hitbox viewer. So you can see the character in the middle of the screen there, and he's got this blue cylinder around him. That blue cylinder is the game's hitbox, and you can see is the character's hitbox, and you can see it looks nothing like Link, the character that he's playing as here. And as this clip plays, he's going to begin a fight against a couple of wolves in this scene. So he's running around, these wolves pop up, and you can see the wolves have several different hitboxes that are all moving, and these wolves, they're swiping at Link. The game's computer, the system's computer is keeping tabs of all of these hitboxes and determining when they do and don't collide and how to handle those collisions. You notice the colors changing there. That's determining whether or not a collision equals damage, for instance. There's all of these things going on. And when you think about the fact that in especially modern video games, there could be hundreds or thousands of different objects on screen that are all being kept tabs on by the game's processor, it's kind of a miracle that video games exist at all, right? That all of these things need to be updated 30 to 60 times every single second, and all of these calculations need to be made for updates in physics. It is really astounding that video games even exist, to be perfectly honest. The next one I want to talk about is invincibility frames. This is a term that you'll hear often abbreviated iframes. This represents an amount of time where the player's character cannot take damage. What's most common is if you've just taken damage, the game will give you iframes to keep you from continually taking damage over and over again every single frame. Otherwise, that might not feel very fair to play. Yeah, I've got another clip here. So this is also from ZFG, same game, same setup. And you'll notice as he's rolling, halfway through the roll, the color changes from blue to pink. What that indicates is that he has invincibility frames during that roll. And actually, I'm going to go back and play through that one more time to count out exactly how many frames. So 1, then the next one, he's going to frame advance forward, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And here's the thing, Ocarina of Time actually runs at 20 frames per second, which means that because he has 10 frames of invincibility there, every time you roll, you have a full half second where you cannot take damage, right? That's why things like this are so important. At that last part of the video, you could see when he was slashing his sword, that red area coming out, indicating the hitbox for damage, right? Yeah, it's really interesting stuff when you pull back the curtain on video games, how they lie to you. Video games lie to you all the time because the visual representation versus the actual physics and what's going on under the hood, they're oftentimes so different and so unique. And from game to game, it can be very cool to learn about all the different ways that games are handling all of this stuff. Next term I want to talk about is auto-scroller. An auto-scroller is a level where the background scrolls automatically. If you've played old school Mario, for instance, this is a fairly common thing in a lot of old Mario games from the Nintendo and Super Nintendo. But nowadays, the term in a speedrun specific context basically just means that there's nothing that a runner can do to affect how quickly a section is played. I'm trying to think. There's a lot of examples of this, but like if there's a scene in a game where the character is on an elevator and you just have to wait for the elevator to reach the end, like you can't control it. So whatever's happening on that elevator, it's effectively an auto-scroller because no matter what the player does, they cannot speed up the process at all. Really big one here, RNG, or random number generation. I think when we were having technical difficulties, there were some folks in the audience who were talking about this. But a lot of times in video games, there are things that aren't technically actually random, but they feel random, or they're random in some way that the player can't really control for. And any time that there's something going on that the player cannot control for it, and they have to read and react what's happening in the video game, they'll refer to it as RNG, or random number generation, because most games have at least some elements that, if they're not literally random, they at least feel random. If you can control for that, then great. But a lot of times, it's really, really hard to find ways to control for it, and maybe even impossible. And the last of these game design terms I want to talk about is soft lock. This is a term that you'll hear a lot in speedruns where it's talking about a situation where even though the game hasn't crashed, it's impossible to continue. There's a lot of different ways in a lot of different games where this can come up. But if you ever hear a speedrunner talk about a potential soft lock, what they're saying is they need to avoid a situation where the game will make it impossible for them to continue, and they'd have to usually exit out of the game entirely in order to get back in. And the next big thing I want to talk about is speedrun categories. From game to game, there's going to be a wildly diverse amount of categories that can be run, but there's a few that are going to be very common, at least, that you're going to see. The most basic type of speedrun is called any %. This is the simplest form of speedrun. Get from the beginning to the end, no restrictions. Then there is 100%. 100% requires the runner to either do all of the things or get all of the things before they reach the end. And actual definitions for what things do or don't count towards 100% completion will vary wildly from game to game. You can imagine if there's like a role-playing game, for instance, where your characters level up. Do your characters all have to reach the maximum level in order for it to count as 100%? Or do you just have to like get all of the items or beat all of the bosses or finish all of the quests? Like there's so many of these kinds of questions that every speedrunning community will need to decide for themselves if they want to have a 100% category. Now, the inverse of 100%, this is a pretty rare category that you actually don't see that often, but it's so interesting that I think it's worth talking about anyway, and that is low percent. Low percent is the inverse of 100% because it requires the runner to do the minimum possible number of things before they reach the end. Now, you might think to yourself, well, isn't that just the same thing as any %? It turns out that is not always the case. Getting fewer things in a low percent speed run takes priority over speed. So a slower run that gets fewer things will rank better on the leaderboard than a faster run that gets more things. To give you an idea of why this is so interesting, I actually have a video clip here. This is from a YouTube channel actually called Lowest Percent. This is contributed to by several different speedrunners from the community. I believe this one was done by Gymnast86, who is a speedrunner of a whole bunch of different Legend of Zelda games. And in this game here, there is an animation that takes place when Link picks up, the player character Link, when he picks up an item for the first time, where he shows it to the camera. And as he's showing it to the camera, he's kind of shifting a little bit, like this, you know? Just kind of moving just slightly. And what's interesting about that animation is it's actually missing a frame, which means in that animation, when he kind of goes in a circle to show what's off, to show off the thing in his hand, it doesn't end at the exact same spot that it starts at, which means every time it happens, he's actually moving very, very slightly. The very first time this was ever found, they had gotten an item and walked away. They actually went to sleep for the night, and when they woke up in the morning, they found Link had slid backwards several feet. And it turns out, in a speedrun, you can actually use that to start sliding through solid walls, because during this animation, collision is turned off, right? Why would the game need to care about collision in the middle of this animation? Because as soon as you press the A button, you get control of Link again. At the top there, they're just showing off and making sure that the positioning is correct for this. And then watch what happens in the bottom right. There's that timer there. It's at 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 1 hour. You notice Link, look at him. He's slowly phasing through the wall. This takes over 2 hours, but it actually gets him through the wall to be able to get through it. Now, that's an incredibly slow process. If you needed to do that in just a regular speed run, that would be awful, but this is low percent. The only reason they do that is because that allows them to skip a key that they would otherwise need to go out of their way to get, and because you're skipping a thing, guess what? That's what counts in low percent, to skip as many things as possible, even if skipping it is slower instead of faster. Other common things that you'll see in categories is glitchless. Glitchless isn't a category in and of itself usually. It's more of a modifier for other kinds of categories. So instead of any percent, you'll see any percent glitchless. Instead of 100%, it'll be 100% glitchless, for instance. And glitchless, as the name implies, means that the use of certain types of errors in game programming cannot be used. And similar to how every community needs to decide for themselves what things do and don't count towards 100%, defining exactly what is and isn't a glitch is never a straightforward process. It always takes communication. It always takes the community coming together to decide for themselves, for their game, what makes the most sense, what makes the run the most fun to do, the most fun to watch, these kinds of questions. Then there are individual level speedruns. Similar, as the name implies, this denotes that a speedrun is not attempted on an entire game, but instead only on a specific level or section. And there are meme categories. This is a fairly common thing in a lot of games that get popular. People find all sorts of fun things to do, where they basically say, okay, instead of trying to beat the game, let's decide on some other thing, some other goal that sort of becomes a joke in and of itself to try and do this thing as quickly as possible. And now we get to the really fun stuff where we can talk about speedrun techniques and glitches. First thing that you'll notice when you start watching GDQ is language selection. Oftentimes, a different language other than English for a video game will be faster. And if that's what's fastest, that's what you want to use. Similarly, there can be different versions of a game, and if using a particular version is faster than the others, then that's going to be important as well. There is a technique called damage boosting, which means if you can intentionally take damage and that somehow makes you go faster, then that's what you want to do. We talked about invincibility frames earlier. Oftentimes that can be one of the biggest reasons why you might want to intentionally take damage. If it gives you invincibility frames that you can use to get through something faster, there you go. Similarly, there's a concept called a death abuse, where maybe in a video game you might intentionally die because, at least in this scenario, dying actually helps you go faster. And if that's the case, then that's what you want to do. RNG manipulation, this is a big one. If you can predict an element that is supposed to be random, then you can use it to your advantage. So if you have prior knowledge to either change things or predict things that are normally random, this can help you go significantly faster in all sorts of different video games. Then there is buffering. Buffering is a system where if a game is loading something, you can usually perform a controller input, and then that input will immediately activate on the first possible frame afterwards. We talked about in inputs how there are some instances where a system can't record every single button input that you're putting on the controller at any given time. Like let's say the system is in the middle of loading in the next area. Well, in some games, you can use that to buffer your first inputs so that when the new area loads in, as soon as it loads in on the very first possible frame, the game just does that input for you as if you had done it on the very first frame perfectly. Then a lot of times in different games, you can do what's called pause buffering, which is where you manually set this up for yourself by pausing the game, then entering an input and then unpausing. The next big one I wanted to talk about is clipping. Clipping. This is the act of moving the character to the other side of a solid barrier. Basically, running through a wall or doing something that gets you through a wall to the other side of it. This is very common in a lot of different games. Most walls and floors in games, it's a common thing, but it's not always. They'll have what's called one-way collision. So typically, a wall or a floor will try and keep the character in, but if you get outside of the wall, they won't care about that. They'll let you right back in. In some 2D games, there's a thing called zipping, where if you get out of bounds, oftentimes the physics of the 2D game can get all wonky and create some really massive speed. Now, for these few things that I was just talking about here, clipping, zipping, buffering, all these things, there are some video clips here oh, wait, actually, sorry, hang on, I've got this first. Overflow and underflow. So this refers to making a part of the game's code go either above the maximum or below the minimum. This can create a lot of different effects in a lot of different games. I think one of the most well-known versions of this is in the Pokemon series. The missing no glitch from the very first generation, Red and Blue, all the way back in the day. This was the talk of playgrounds everywhere and school buses everywhere when I was a kid. But it turns out that that type of a glitch underflows an item in your inventory so that instead of having 1 or 0 or a negative number, well, how does the game handle a negative number? It wraps it around to think, well, this is a really high positive number, isn't it? So that's all that kind of a glitch is, for instance. If you think about overflow and underflow in terms of coordinates on the screen, you can do what's called a screen wrap or a level wrap in some games where, usually in 2D games, it can be possible for your character's coordinates on the screen to either underflow lower than the minimum or overflow higher than the maximum. I've got some video clips for these. Oh, crap. Sorry, one more. Negative speed. This is another example of underflowing, where in some games, in this case usually 3D, they have no cap on how fast your character can move backwards, which effectively allows them to reach infinite speed. This might be a little hard to think about if you've never played video games before, but if you're holding the controller in your hand and you see the character loaded into the map, whatever direction you push the joystick, your character is going to turn to face that direction, right? Which means moving backwards is not normally possible, right? Because if you start moving the joystick in a direction so that your character would be going backwards, your character is going to turn to face that direction, right? Which means that you would need to go out of your way to find some unique way to make your character keep moving backwards over a long stretch of time. And this is actually where I've got some various video clips that shows off so many of these different glitches and techniques. This is from an earlier Games Done Quick event. We have Super Mario Bros. 3 being run co-op by Mitch Flowerpower and Grand Pooh Bear. And this is a very famous clip where the precision that's required in order to do this is pretty intense. But basically, you could see, first try, he makes it look so easy. He's just able to clip into the wall and skip basically the entire level. And here, it's hard to really describe exactly why this all works at all. But the level of precision that's required for this is really intense. Like, if I tried to do this on this level, I could try it for hours and never get it. But because these folks are so practiced at it, they're so good at it, that this particular glitch where they clip inside of the wall allows them to just skip through this entire level. Then this is another example of clipping here in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. This is by Johnny Boomer. And this one is sort of interesting because it has more to do with the physics of the player character Link. You'll notice he's jumping into this wall in a certain way, and that's changing how the game's physics is treating the character, so that here, this one wall that normally would keep him out, turns out, hang on, there it is. Yep, he just jumps right through it. I've actually been able to do that glitch. That one's not that hard to do, believe it or not. Let's see. The next one. This is from another video on the YouTube channel Lowest Percent, where in this one they are showing off a very famous glitch called the Door of Time skip in Ocarina of Time. You'll notice that in this instance, the two walls there actually have a little gap in between them. And that gap is actually really important because exploiting that gap is actually how this whole glitch was ever even found. But you can see this one, this very early video of it is from all the way back in 2008 when this glitch was first found. The character's rolling in a certain way and manipulating themselves in a certain way to just get just enough of the character through that tiny little gap, and they're able to get back in bounds on the other side of the door, making it look so easy. And I've got one more here. This is another pretty famous clipping example from a Zelda game. This is from The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker HD, run by Linkus7. And here there's a barrier. You can kind of see it there behind the player character. And the level of precision that's required in order to make this one work is also exceptionally impressive. Yeah, people worked for a very, very long time to try to find any way through this barrier, and when it was finally found, it was such a massive deal because it wound up being sort of a choke point in the speedruns for this game. That, you know, if we can find some way to get past this barrier, we could finally figure it out. The level of precision that's required there is very impressive. I want to say the angles that your character can be facing in that game, and this is actually a fairly common thing in a lot of different games as well, but the number of angles that you can be facing in the game as your character is moving around, I believe there's 65,335 or 55 angles, and basically there's only one that works in order to make this whole glitch even possible. So yeah, it took a lot of work by a lot of people in order to find that particular glitch. Then, let's see. Oh yeah, this is a really cool example of level wrapping in Sonic 3 and Knuckles. So this is run by Mike89 at a previous Games Done Quick event. What you're going to see here is he's going to use some very particular, very difficult maneuvers to get out of bounds. And when he's out of bounds, this is an example, first of all, of zipping, where he's manipulating the motion on the controller in order to, first of all, go very, very fast. And essentially what he does is he goes all the way to the left, and when he goes to the left, the X and Y coordinates for where he is on the level gets messed up. Here, I'll play it for me one more time, right? So first he goes out of bounds, and then he goes all the way to the left. And when he goes so far to the left, the X coordinate for where he is on the level goes negative. And when the X coordinate goes negative, the system doesn't know how to handle a negative number. So instead it just says, okay, well, you must be at a very high positive number, which means that the system just wraps him around from the beginning of the level all the way to the end of it, allowing him to skip needing to go through that entire level. And then, let's see. Oh yeah, this is another very famous example of clipping, also from Super Mario 64. This is actually from a European Speedrunners Assembly event done by a speedrunner named Cheese. This is another very famous glitch known as the backwards long jump. We talked about how in 3D games, a lot of times it can be very difficult to keep your character moving backwards because your character is going to turn to face whatever direction you're holding the joystick in. Well, it turns out in Super Mario 64, there's a jump technique that you can do that by doing it backwards against a staircase, it effectively allows you to continue to mash the A button very, very fast. And every time you do it, Mario's gaining speed in the negative direction. And because the developers didn't put a cap for how fast you can be moving negative, that means that you can go so fast that you just start clipping through walls. This is another glitch that if you've got a copy of Super Mario 64 lying around, you might be able to do this yourself. But yeah, it just makes it look so easy there. Actually, yeah, here's a second example of the exact same glitch here. Normally in this staircase, there's a warp that it'll keep warping you from the top of the staircase back down to the bottom unless you've done a certain amount of the game. But by using this glitch, you get going so fast that the game can't even keep up and winds up allowing you through. Okay, so these next ones here are, actually, I'm going to skip past that one. So this is also from The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Link is 7 here. This is a good example of buffering, and pause buffering in particular. And again, moving backwards to gain an infinite amount of speed. In the water, basically what he's going to be doing is he's going to be pausing the game, pressing up, unpausing, pausing the game, pressing down, pausing, and just doing that over and over and over again, so that basically he's only unpaused for no more than a single frame at any time, which means every time he's unpausing, he's gaining more speed in the negative direction over and over again. So you can see here he goes into the water, gets himself set up, and you see the character, every time he unpauses the game, is looking up then down, then up then down, then up then down, then up then down. And every time he's doing that, the character is gaining a little bit more speed every single time, right? Now, it turns out this glitch has changed a lot over the years because doing this takes a lot of time. And you can imagine that building up this much speed was a very costly part of the run. It takes so much time to set all this up and get it all squared away that eventually people were like, we need to come up with some faster ways to do this. I guess this is a good moment to provide a quick warning for flashing lights if you've got any sensitivities to epilepsy or any things like that. You might want to look away for a moment here. Because it turns out once you get going fast enough, this is what happens. But it takes so long to build up this speed. What's happening here is every single frame, Link is moving so fast in the water that he's moving so fast that he's moving beyond the boundary of what the camera can see. So the camera, every single frame, is basically swapping places with him. And yeah, here he's able, because he's collected so much speed, he's able to swim across this entire open ocean in this game in a matter of seconds. But eventually they figured out that it turns out that if you're fast enough, you actually don't even need to pause. So right here, you can see Linkus's hand moving up and down out of the bottom of the frame. He's literally holding the controller, doing this as fast as he can on the joystick to move the joystick up and down every single frame so that he's gaining more and more speed. And eventually he gets to the point where his hand starts to get tired and he's like, okay, well now we're going to start doing the pause method. But yeah, this just gives you an idea of the ingenuity that these speedrunners have when they are coming up with ideas. All right, so there's a few more of these that I want to talk about. There is a glitch type called a wrong warp. A wrong warp is a glitch that forces the game to load an incorrect map, right? So we talked earlier about loading zones and how when you go through a loading zone that tells the game to unload the area that you're currently in and load in the next one. Well, it turns out if you can find some way to manipulate that process and adjust it, it can be pretty powerful, including in some instances an example of this called a credits warp, which is executing a wrong warp directly into the game's credits, which can be very powerful and make some speedruns very, very fast. But yeah, this is a very old video segment. I think, yeah, this was made in 2013 or 2014 by Narcissa Wright. And this is a very old run that actually the any percent run doesn't even do this technique anymore, but it's such a good example of this and it was one of my favorites. So I couldn't not include it here. So she's entered into this blue warp and done a glitch to keep control of the player character, right? So that blue warp is trying to activate a loading zone and trying to send the character to a certain point in the game where that blue warp would take her. Except instead, the character maintains control, moves out of the way, and goes back through the other door instead, right? In Ocarina of Time, in the game's code, there's a giant list of entrances, right? And normally, the game out of the blue warp would try to take you to a certain one. But instead of going through the blue warp, maintains control, goes back out through the door, and it just turns out that when you apply the same modifier from the blue warp to that door instead, it takes you basically all the way through to the end of the game, literally to the last dungeon during the escape sequence at the very end of the game. So that skips, 95% of all of the game there. Then the next glitch I wanted to talk about is arbitrary code execution. This is sort of the holy grail of glitches because at the end of the day, everything that's happening in a video game has to come back to code at some point, a literal string of ones and zeros. And if you can find some way to write your own code and force the game to execute it, you can do just about anything. This is an example here. This is the, well, it was the world record for Super Mario World. I actually don't remember if this record still stands or not, but we're about to watch an entire speed run. So in this first level, once he gets control, you're going to see him do a whole series of movements that are setting up various items in various positions. And the complexity behind this is pretty astonishing because for all of these things to happen so quickly, the amount of precision that you need is it's just astonishing. Because if any one of these things goes wrong, the entire glitch would fail. But he's able to execute a credits warp through arbitrary code execution, right? All of those objects that are on the screen, they have an X position and a Y position. And essentially, by manipulating exactly where all of those things are, he's setting up code in the game to read a certain way and then executing another glitch to force the system to execute that code. And the code that he wrote is warp directly to the credits. That's essentially what he's telling the game to do there. And here's another example from when was this run? I think this was a couple of years ago at SGDQ. Yeah, this one's very long actually, so I don't think I'm going to show the entirety of it, but this shows how involved a lot of these glitches can be here, because every time the runner Claire Lindy, every time that she's moving in between these loading zones, every time she's spawning in a bomb, every time she's picking something up, every time she's moving the character Link around, she's doing all of these things specifically because it's manipulating what's going on in the system's memory, and it's essentially writing code into the system's memory that eventually, it takes a while. So actually, I'm going to speed it up here a little bit. Eventually, this is what happens. Can you play from here? There we go. And there we go. This right here is the game's debug menu. This was invented by the team who was making the game so that they could test stuff while they were creating the game and testing the game. It turns out it's completely inaccessible by normal means, but essentially she did all of these very long sequences of button inputs to write code into the game's memory, force it to execute, and the code that she was writing was telling the system, hey, you need to open up the debug menu. So she's now giving herself basically every item in the entire game. She's setting flags for bosses to have been beaten, for dungeons to have been finished, and other things like this. Yeah, it's an incredibly powerful glitch because, when you do figure out a system in a game for arbitrary code execution, you can effectively tell the game to do almost anything. And as long as it's something that the system can handle, it's possible. So it's kind of astonishing. It's very rare. There are very few games where arbitrary code execution has ever even been found. But for those that have, it's been astonishing to see what all of these communities have come up with. This last one that I want to talk about here is just a term that I use or have come up with. I don't necessarily think that there's a good catch-all that you'll hear from speedrunners themselves, but there are so many glitches that I call double up glitches, which is basically if you force a game to do two things at the exact same time, there's so many instances where the game just does not know how to handle that. And if people find a version of that and it's advantageous for a speedrun, then there you go. You found a brand new glitch. So oftentimes when people are hunting for new glitches in a video game, this is one of the first things that they'll try to do is figure out, okay, how many different ways can I test doing two things at the same time in this game and see if it will create some sort of an advantageous situation for me in a speed run. Actually, I'm going to skip that one because it's a little hard to describe. But here's a good example of that. This is back to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild by Johnny Boomer. This game has a bullet time mechanic where if you're in midair and you pull out your bow, everything slows down. So here, at the exact same time, he's doing two things, right? He's pulling out his bow to slow down time, and he's hitting the enemy to bounce off the enemy's back, and at the exact same time, he's putting the bow away to turn off the bullet time effect. And it turns out that the bullet time slows everything down by, I think it's 19 times, so you're moving at 1/19th the speed. And at the exact moment where he bounces off of the enemy's back, he also turns off that bullet time, and it turns out the game doesn't know how to handle that correctly. So when he bounces off the enemy's back, he bounces off the enemy with 19 times as much speed as he's supposed to have. Here, I'll show it to you one more time here. So he bounces off the enemy's back and just goes flying off with all of this speed that he should not have, but it's because he intentionally stopped the bullet time effect at the exact same moment that he was bouncing off of the enemy's back there. And then this one, which one was this? Oh yeah, this is the wind bomb technique. This is another similar version of that, where the game gives you two different bombs that you can place. And similarly, if you slow yourself down in midair by jumping by jumping and then pulling out your bow, you can place one of those bombs and then place the second bomb. And by blowing up the first one, it blows up the first one into the second one, and the second one hits Link. And at that exact moment where the second bomb hits the player character at very high speed, you turn off the slowdown, you turn off the bullet time effect, and then similarly, the game doesn't know how to handle that, so it maintains all of this speed and just sends you flying. So you can imagine there's so many instances in various games where doing two things at the exact same time can just break stuff. And the next thing I want to talk about at GDQ, there's a lot of things that will get shown that aren't technically speed runs, or maybe they are, but there's unique runs where different unique things are happening. So I call these speedrun adjacent stuff. One of the most common is high score challenges. Back in the day of arcades, back in the 80s and all that, they didn't really usually do speed runs as often because a lot of those games were designed with a high score mechanic in mind of, hey, get as high of a score as you possibly can. And there were groups set up to try and keep track of that for people to set their own records and break each other's records and form competition there. There are rhythm games that get shown off at GDQ especially. There are randomizer challenges, bingo challenges, blindfolded challenges, yes, really. 2 players, 1 controller challenges, where 2 different players will be holding onto the same controller. There's a thing called crowd control, one mind, and there we go. Okay, I was going to say, I thought I had these video clips set up that they would play after each one, but this is an example of a rhythm game that was shown off at a recent GDQ event called My. You'll see people refer to this one as like the washing machine game because it looks like you're looking at a window of a washing machine. Watch his hands. Look at how fast his hands are moving in order to hit all of these in time. Star Rod Kirby 86 is the runner here. It's just so impressive. Yeah, and actually, this game is in the arcade here at GDQ, in fact. So you can play this yourself, and if you're this good, you'll definitely amass a following, because, this is a incredibly impressive speed and accuracy here that gets shown off at these events. This is an example of a randomizer challenge. So instead of the base Ocarina of Time video game, these 2 players here are playing a randomizer where they take all of the game's items and shuffle them up, which changes how the game gets played pretty drastically. It doesn't really count as a standard speed run because every time you do that, all of the locations for everything gets shifted around, which means that you're not directly competing against each other with an identical version of the game, so it's not really fair to consider that a speed run the same way. But it's incredibly fun, and there's so many different games out there where randomizers have been created. I'm sure you can, if you've got a favorite video game, you might be able to Google that and see if one exists for that. Here, this is a similar idea. This is a bingo challenge where a few years ago, Runner Guy 2489 did this, where instead of needing to beat the game, he's also playing Ocarina of Time, he has a bingo card in front of him of a bunch of different challenges within the game. And similar to bingo, the goal isn't to beat the game. The goal is to complete 5 of these challenges in a row, column, or diagonal as quickly as possible. So instead of just playing the game normally, this completely changes how you think about your route, how you think about what you want to do. Similarly, there's, I'm sure, a handful of games that have been made with these kinds of bingo challenges as well. That's another thing I'm sure you could Google to see if your favorite game has one. Here, we have Bubsia. If you see on the left, he is wearing a blindfold. Everything that's going on the screen, he cannot see. In fact, his screen is behind him. He's not even looking at his screen. So you can see he's playing Super Mario 64 here and showing off. Here we go. Oh, yeah, so I think, I'm trying to remember if that was an instance where actually something kind of went wrong or not, but either way, just the amount of practice that it takes to be able to play a game blindfolded, but believe it or not, there are people out there who love playing games so much that in some instances they will learn how to do that. And Bubsia in particular has done an excellent job learning how to play Super Mario 64 with a blindfold on just like that. Yeah, you can imagine. It's hard enough to do this level even when you can see. And speaking of blindfolded, this is a blindfolded 2 players, 1 controller run. So this is the original Nintendo game, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! And we have Sinister1 and Zallard1, who are both holding the controller. They have the controller split down the middle. One of them is holding the buttons on the right, the other one is holding the D-pad on the left. And together, blindfolded, they are both playing this game at the exact same time. These are probably 2 of the best players of this game in the world. I know that they traded world records back and forth for quite a while, so the 2 of them working together in a co-op like that to show off such an astounding feat was very cool to see. And the last topic I want to talk about with you all today is sort of the history of speedruns for charity. There's so many different events that are held every year to raise money for charity that are focused around video games, but I'm really only going to touch on a few very major ones. I'm sure if you're interested in learning about these or others, you can ask around and go to Google. Because there are plenty of speedrun events that are held every single year. And the first one that I want to talk about is Desert Bus for Hope. They can be found at www.desertbus.org. They started in 2007, and they are still going. Desert Bus is a really interesting one because it's not really about speedrunning. How many of you have heard of Desert Bus before? Okay, all of you, good. So for those of you on the video who might not have heard of this, I actually copied over a section of the game's Wikipedia page because this is a game that was never actually released. It was produced in the mid-90s by Penn Jillette and Teller for the Sega CD, I believe. The whole idea behind it was that the intention was not to make a good video game. The intention was to make a joke video game. So there's several different mini games that are all compiled together into one game. And thankfully, this got leaked to the internet. Otherwise, we might not have ever actually played any version of this because it never made it to stores. But the entire thing was a joke. And one particular game considered by Penn to be the best part of the collection was Desert Bus. So let me read to you the description from the Wikipedia page of exactly what Desert Bus is. Desert Bus is a simulation trick minigame and a featured part of Electronic Gaming Monthly's preview. It is the most notorious minigame in the actual game. The objective of the game is to drive a bus from Tucson, Arizona to Las Vegas, Nevada in real time at a maximum speed of 45 miles per hour. The feat requires 8 hours of continuous play in real time to complete. The bus contains no passengers, there is little scenery aside from an occasional rock or bus stop sign, and there is no traffic. The road between Tucson and Las Vegas is simplified compared to the real highways. It is now completely straight. The bus veers to the right slightly and thus requires the player's constant attention. If the bus stops or veers off the road, it will stall and must be towed back to Tucson, also in real time. If the player makes it to Las Vegas, 1 point is scored. The player has the option to make the return trip to Tucson for another point, a decision which must be made in a few seconds or the game ends. Players may continue to make trips and score points as long as their endurance lasts. The game cannot be paused. So the folks who put together Desert Bus for charity, basically what they do is they say, all right, here's what we're going to do. For the first hour that we're going to play, it will cost $1. The second hour will cost $1.07. The third hour will cost, and they keep increasing by, I think, 7% every time or something like that. I don't remember the exact formula. So for the first few hours, it's incredibly cheap. But in order to get them to continue to play for longer and longer and longer, people need to donate more and more money to get them to keep playing. Desert Bus twice now has broken the $1 million mark, which means that, yeah, twice now they've gone for over a week when they've done their events. I think they're done every year in November, I believe, if I remember correctly. Then, of course, there is Games Done Quick. Hi, you're all here. You know what this is. But www.gamesdonequick.com, typically held for the Prevent Cancer Foundation and Doctors Without Borders. Started in 2010 by Mike Uyama. The story there is that they in 2010 they had a location set out for where they were going to hold the very first event, Classic Games Done Quick, but something went wrong with the location, and effectively they had to move the event into Mike's mom's basement. And I don't remember exactly how much money they raised, but it was a very fun thing for all of the folks who were there to be involved in. And eventually they decided that they would make it an annual thing that has continued to happen. And now it happens twice every year. Awesome Games Done Quick in January is held for the Prevent Cancer Foundation. And then in the Summer Games Done Quick is held for Doctors Without Borders. In addition to those two major events, there are also lots of smaller events that are held every year. And information about those can be found at gamesdonequick.com and by following Games Done Quick's Twitter account. They post updates there all the time. And in fact, on their Twitch channel, they are hosting speedrunning related content 365 days a year, which is astonishing. The folks who put all this together are really dedicated to it. And I'm really glad that I've gotten to be a part of this in the meantime. There's a couple other events that I do want to highlight, though, as well. The European Speedrunners Assembly, or ESAmarathon.com. They've held their events for Save the Children and Alzheimer Fonden. They hold the events, I believe it's in Sweden every year, where they actually hold it, but it's not strictly for European folks. There's Americans who go to Sweden for the ESA. There's Europeans who come to America for Games Done Quick. They have been running since 2012. And then lastly, RPG Limit Break. This is another event that was started as sort of an offshoot of Games Done Quick. Some folks who've been involved with Games Done Quick previously put together RPG Limit Break, which is a speedrunning event that mainly, specifically as the name implies, focuses on role-playing games. Because a lot of times those games are longer, which means it's harder for those games to get featured at something like Games Done Quick. Those events raise money for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, and those have been going since 2015 to the present. There's so many other events than just these four if you ask around, I'm sure you'll learn so much more about. Thank you all for coming to this, and this has been Speedrunning 101, or what the heck are they talking about? At this point, if we have any questions, you can feel free to come on up to the mic and ask. But if not, I think that'll be it. So, what do you say? No? All right. Thank you, everybody. Once again, my name is WeGoGiant. You can reach me at the email address or on Discord. Thank you.